Hey, so welcome to another episode of the FLŌ TRIBE podcast. So in this episode, I'm speaking with Brandon Sundwall. So Brandon is a personal trainer based here in Los Angeles. I've actually interviewed him before, and you can see some of the clips from that interview on the channel right now. Now, the reason I brought him back was because some of the topics that we started exploring, we couldn't really go that deep into them because he was the only one on camera, which makes it kind of hard to have a real conversation. So I wanted to bring him back. I wanted to have this real conversation with him because he's a super knowledgeable guy. He understands so many aspects of health and fitness. He's obviously highly educated in this subject, and I really wanted him to share some of his expertise. And one topic in particular that I found extremely interesting and kind of important is understanding the difference between training for performance and training for longevity. So I hope you get as much out of this interview as I did, and here is my conversation with Brandon Sundwall. So we've done this before, but in the first version it was just you on camera, and what I noticed when I was rewatching a lot of the videos was there was some really good stuff that I would have loved to go deeper on, but because you were the only one on camera, we really couldn't do that. But before we get into any of it, I would think let's just kind of introduce yourself quickly to people about your background, how you got into training, and what kind of inspired you to do what you do.
Sure. So my name is Brandon. I've been training since I was probably like 13, 14 with weights. I mean, I played sports growing up, but like first time I went into a weight room, I wrestled for a good part of my life competitively through college. So that was my main sport, played football, and then competed in powerlifting, CrossFit after that. But basically, since I started lifting weights, I haven't stopped. And I now work as a personal trainer, both in person and online, in the Los Angeles area, and then online all over the world.
The one thing we touched on in our first session together that I really thought was interesting and that I want to talk about is the difference between training for performance and training for longevity.
Sure.
Quickly, I started training in martial arts when I was 26, and I did that pretty aggressively for about 12 to 13 years. And at the time, I don't think I ever thought about the consequences of what that type of intense training could have on my body, right? Like, it's all about the performance. Mm-hmm. It's all about beast mode. It's all about killing yourself. And it even becomes like a badge of honor. Like, I remember we would joke about how broken our bodies were. And you joke about it because it's the only way you can actually kind of make sense of the fact that you're destroying your body in this way. But now, many years later, I'm feeling some of the consequences of that, I'd say, irresponsible training in some ways. So I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that and kind of what can someone do who's getting into performance training to make sure that they don't pay too high of a price later on, but also people who've gone through performance training and maybe are having some issues because of that.
Yeah, I think especially in the combat sports, there's this sort of like ego-driven need to prove oneself constantly. I think one of the most dangerous things is like fighting in the practice room as opposed to in actual competition. And that leads to sort of that overtraining situation. I think too, one of the issues is that sometimes we have to touch the stove to realize it's hot. So in some ways, part of me thinks that it's almost an unavoidable reality. Until someone gets injured, they won't prioritize prehab training.
Of course.
It takes a unique individual or to have a really good coach with the foresight to build that mindset of like, this is a long game, not a sprint in training. And I think like the focus of the training should be not on the practice, but on the outcome, right? So like this is just preparation for something, not the thing itself.
Yeah, and I think what I saw a lot of is not just the ego of the fighter or the athlete, but it's the ego of the coaches sometimes. Where like I think fight sports are a good example because there's so many different coaches involved, especially in MMA, right? So an MMA fighter will have usually a boxing coach, a Muay Thai coach. Sometimes it's a combined striking coach, but I've seen guys who have a boxing coach, a Muay Thai coach, a wrestling coach, a jiu-jitsu coach, a strength and conditioning coach. So one fighter could have 5 different coaches. In some cases, they're all part of the same team, which is great because then they're talking to each other and they're making sure that they're all working towards the benefit of that fighter. But that's something you'll see at a higher level, right? Because that fighter is worth it. right? Because this person's either in the UFC or some big organization and there's money involved.
Yeah.
In the lower amateur levels, it's usually that fighter who's traveling to all these different locations to get that training in.
Yes.
So they go to their Muay Thai gym, they go to their wrestling gym, they go to the strength and conditioning gym. And what I've noticed is the ego is each coach wants to be the alpha, right? They want to be the one, right? So they're not really thinking about the fact that, hey, I just killed myself in jiu-jitsu, but now you're trying to kill me in wrestling, and then I have to go do strength and conditioning, and that guy's going to try to kill me.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the biggest issues, is sometimes it's the ego of the coaches. And what would you say about, is there a way you think that you can kind of take control a little bit of your own destiny in that sense? Like in the sense that take a little bit of control of your own training and not just abide to whatever these coaches are telling you to do.
In speaking about athletes?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a challenging thing, right? Because people that are athletes are not normal, right? So it's not normal to want to train 8 hours a day for something that's not guaranteed.
Yeah.
So you have someone that's already committed to doing whatever is possible to get as good as possible to achieve whatever outcome. And I think like the coach's job is to put the governor on them. Yeah. Right? There's someone that will go full throttle, all out. That's in their nature. That's why they're such a high performer.
Yeah.
You know, so I think it's hard. It's rare, and I mean, it happens. Some athletes are like they have foresight and they have a more intelligent approach. But I think your average athlete, as a high performer, like always thinks more is more. Yeah. Right. So I think it's funny, but like the Rocky movie series has been immensely detrimental to so many athletes' careers. In the sense, not because Sylvester Stallone is a terrible actor, but because the idea that you must work harder than everybody else to get further, right? That you have to be out in the snow when your opponent is sleeping, and like coming up in wrestling, so many times it was like, well, you have to run another mile because your opponent ran 5, so you have to run 6, and that mentality of more is better is just burned into young athletes. And work ethic is immensely important. If you don't have work ethic, you're not going to get anywhere at a high level of athletics. But the idea that more is always better leads to injury, overtraining, and burnout. You know, so I think it's a coach's job to reel those athletes back, since they are predisposed to have that mentality that more is better. So to say that like smarter is better, not more is better.
Yeah, and or even less is more sometimes.
Yeah, I agree.
Like
for sure.
Personally, I noticed as I got older that the hardcore strength and conditioning sessions, I was hungover the next day. Yeah. Like that's what it felt like. It really felt like I can still do it. My body still allowed me to get through that crazy workout, but the recovery was so much harder. Yeah. Like as where when I was younger, I would pop out and I'm good to go. Now it's like 2 days of pain and fatigue, and for what? Yeah. Like I don't really need to perform, or even if I did, I don't know that it would help. Yes. You know, and I think a lot of it is strength and conditioning, because like I'm getting back to fighting, but even any sport, there's the strength and conditioning component of what you do, and then there's the technical side of what you do. Yeah. From a technical perspective, you have to put in the reps. Yes. You have to put in the time, because that's how you master your craft. Practice. Yeah, it's the practice. If you want to have the best throw, if you want to have the best kick, if you want to have the best anything, the amount of repetitions you put in will have a strong effect on that, right? Yes. But from a strength and conditioning perspective, I don't know that you have to destroy your body in order to get those gains. No, quite the opposite. I mean, if we have to look at who is most knowledgeable in strength and conditioning, right? So we go back 50 years, we look at the Russians and the East Germans, right? They have this idea of GPP, or general physical preparedness, right? You take athlete, you make them generally physically prepared. Physical fitness in terms of cardiovascular output, flexibility, pliability, mobility, explosiveness, and then you train them sport specific. But that training should never impede the sport practice, right? So you should never do so many deadlifts that you can't throw a punch if you're an MMA fighter or something like that. Yeah. And I think, again, back to this idea that more is more, like we ran away in the United States, especially with this idea that we just had to train so hard all the time and everything go 100%, versus having worked with some NFL players before and being around pro athletes. Basically the mentality is like, don't break them. Okay, what you have in front of you is perfect. Like that is an athlete. Just make them more durable. Yeah. They already are. Like they were born that way. That's why they're elite performers. Like genetics played a role. And that's just a mentality that all athletes should have. Like if your sport is boxing, boxing doesn't take place in the weight room. What happens in the weight room should supplement or support what takes place in the ring. Yeah. And one thing I saw a lot of in MMA was guys who just never make it to their fights.
Yeah.
Because their training is just too intense.
Of course.
Right? Whether it's sparring too hard or whether I've seen a lot of injuries happen in the weight room or happen in strength and conditioning sessions. Again, because of sometimes it's coaches with big egos
Yeah.
that get in there and just want to prove how badass they are and how they're able to, like, I had a guy, I'm not going to say his name, but I had a guy, I showed up for one of my first ever private strength and conditioning sessions. I finally decided I'm going to see what this is about. It was a gym where a lot of the fighters I worked with were going to. And the first thing he did, he's like, come with me. And he showed me a spot in the parking lot. And he's like, this is where your buddies puked yesterday. You'll be here soon.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's how you're opening this? Like, you're showing me where I'm going to throw up?
What an intro. Yeah, yeah.
Like, I don't know. I'm not feeling this so much anymore. Like,
Yeah.
and especially as a coach. Like, I wasn't a fighter. I was just trying to stay on the level of the fighters I was working with. But even as a fighter, I just don't get it. Like, I never thought that way. I never thought you need to get to that point.
Yeah.
But I think that's the mentality, and it still is in a lot of cases.
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, like what's true for working with an athlete is true for general population. What is the desired outcome? What is the purpose of what you're doing? Why did you choose that exercise? Why did you choose that training session? And sometimes, to my wrestling experience, we do these round robin sort of training sessions where, like, every minute a new opponent would rotate in on you that was fresh.
Yeah.
Right? And, you know, like, just wear you down.
We used to call that the Shark Tank.
Yeah, just grind, like an hour nonstop like that. And, like, you have to understand the intent was mental toughness, which is a skill that has to be built as well.
100%.
But if you conflate that with skill training, the technique was terrible because the person is exhausted. So if your intent is to build the technique of the athlete and you're doing that, it makes no sense. You picked the wrong tool, right? So you need a balance, and a good coach understands intent. They're not going to do months of that same training. They're going to intersperse that in between and know what the athlete needs more or less, like that. And it's the same thing in the gym. You know, like, if you have an athlete who's super strong, they don't need more deadlifts. They need more mobility or something like that. So it's like, you have to pick your tools wisely when working with someone.
And I think that's an interesting segue, is mobility training. I think that's something that's become more popular at this point, like just movement training. Guys like Ido Portal came on the scene and started training Conor McGregor, and everybody's like, who's that weird guy with his weird movement stuff?
Yeah.
But I've had a couple buddies that have been into this stuff for years. And what's amazing about it to me, and having gone into it myself, is that suddenly everything else improves.
Yes.
Your strength improves, your technique improves, everything you're doing, no matter what your sport is, football, basketball, fighting, doesn't matter. If your mobility improves, every other aspect of your training improves.
Yeah, agreed.
And I think that, to me, like, if we're talking about performance and longevity, that's something that touches on both.
Sure.
Right? Because, you know, as a 45-year-old now, I'm proud of the fact that I can still get down on the floor like this and get up really easily.
Yeah.
There's a lot of guys my age, that's not happening.
Oh, terrifyingly
Like,
so, yeah.
Yeah, and guys even younger than me who are already, it's like, oh, excuse me, I'm going to have to get up and, oh, you want me to go on the floor? I don't know. Like,
yeah.
Whew, that scares me. Like, the idea of the day that I can't get back up easily once I go to the floor, that scares me.
Yeah.
And I think mobility training is a way that you kind of ensure that you'll be able to stay in that world for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree. I mean, I think we're seeing a trend towards that. But again, what's new is old, right?
Oh, yeah,
so this
of course.
goes back to this idea of general physical preparedness, and that, like, you need capacity first, and then you can layer intensity. And I think a lot of times it's just culturally we want results. Yeah. So we go for intensity before we have capacity. So if
capacity on Instagram is boring, dude.
Yeah, I know. No booty shots are made with capacity, right? But you know, I think, like, okay, so your hip, you don't have 90 degrees of hip flexion. Why are you trying to squat 500 pounds? You know, like, what, you don't have the capacity in your joint yet, right? So, you know, and also, like, capacity improves performance, like you're indicating. You know, if I can reach greater lengths and, like, reaching back for a punch, I can come at you at angles. Like, Ido Portal creates those angles that are crazy, that are unseen and things like that. And also, just your injury risk is lower because the injury occurs in the end range of joint mobility, right? We don't have injuries in the strong point. We don't have injuries in the midpoint of range of motion. We have them in the end range.
Yeah.
Now,
the elbow versus
extension, right? Hyperextension of the elbow and stuff. But if I have control over the end range, if I have strength and tissue tension in the end range, my injury risk goes down.
Yeah.
So my career just became longer, and I became more dangerous because I can compete at a high level and acquire more skills while being physically viable still. So I think, like, performance and longevity are, in that sense, intertwined. Like, one is not unique from the other. You get
But I
more.
think you're seeing it, though. And what's interesting is you're seeing at the highest level of sports, right? Because look at guys like LeBron James, I think is a great example. How long has he been playing basketball?
Oh.
17 years at this point in the NBA, I think it is, or 18 years, something like that.
Something crazy
and
like that.
And he is still at the top.
Yeah.
Right? As where before, after 18 years, guys were retired.
Yeah.
Like they weren't even thinking about continuing. I think you're seeing it in hockey. Guys in their 40s still playing hockey. You're seeing it in so many different sports. Guys like Tom Brady, guys like that are just going longer and still performing at a higher level. And that's all because of sports performance. It's all because of better understanding the body, mobility training, exactly what you were touching on. Is how can I train to prevent injury versus waiting for injury to happen and then dealing with whatever
recovery.
that. So what are some of the ways that people are doing that other than what you've touched on already?
Well, I think there's this term prehab, right? Rehab is when you become injured.
It's too late.
And you Prehab is the idea of like building injury proofing your body essentially, right? So looking at like where are their muscular imbalances or where are their joint imbalances and addressing those beforehand. Traditionally it would be like stretching, foam rolling, myofascial release, things like that. But now there's like joint specific training where people are like exploring those end ranges and creating like isometric tension in them and things like that and exploring injurious patterns, right? Like for open field athletes, an ACL tear or something like that. Like if you could create rotational capacity in the knee, you're less likely to get injured in that open field moment when you cut hard and things. So I'm seeing like a lot of these top trainers working with, explosive athletes like NFL players and basketball players, like doing things that just look like stretching on paper, but they're actually building that joint capacity.
So what's an example? Like, can you like one simple example of a joint capacity?
Building exercise? Yeah, absolutely. So there's something called functional range conditioning, which is fairly popular. A lot of NBA and then NHL teams are using it, MLB. So creating sort of taking a joint to its end range, overcoming something called the stretch reflex, and then creating isometric tension, right? So say that I was trying to create some more hip range of motion right here. So expanding specifically hip internal rotation, coming into a stretch position, holding that here, overcoming that stretch reflex, getting about 15 degrees more, and then pulling into an isometric contraction in that, and now connecting sort of that neural drive from my brain to the actual physiology of the tissue and there and just repeating that pattern. So it's basically expanding my joint's capacity for movement over time.
Right, so you're strengthening everything around the joint. Is that the idea?
Connective tissue, muscle.
And not just muscle, but everything that's connected in that area.
Well, basically. I mean, if you've ever opened up a cadaver, right, and you look inside.
Everyone has, obviously.
Yeah, of course. Everyone's cut up in a dead body. But when you look inside, there's not a label that says quadricep.
Right.
Right? There's
100%.
or that says like patella tendon.
Just a whole bunch of.
There's just tissue, right? And our body doesn't differentiate between what we've labeled. That's an anatomist that's labeled that. So the idea is that we're an interconnected system, right? We have our tissue fascia, we have muscle, there's ligament, there's tendon, and then also it's innervated by these nerves, so the brain's involved. So it's integrating this whole system in a way that's building capacity, like that.
So does this make any sense? Because this has been explained to me before where, for example, if I could do the same movement, but if I change the weight involved in that movement, I'm engaging different muscle groups, right? Where if I'm lifting heavy, I'm engaging, let's say, one part of the muscle group. But if I'm just kind of repeating that motion without weight, now there's something else that's kind of being developed. Does that make sense, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, in exercise, there's something called the SAID principle, which is specific adaptation to imposed demand, right? So your body's going to adapt to whatever you do over time. It's the reason that you constantly have to increase the weight to get stronger, right? And the idea would be that, say that you're doing a curl, right? And you're doing it with 20 pounds, and you're able to isolate so that mostly the muscle that's being worked is just your bicep right there. Now you double that and you grab like a 40-pound one, which is heavier. Now you have to heave that weight up.
So you're getting.
You're involving other muscles. But at the same time, like even though you're isolating the bicep, the muscles in the rotator cuff and the lat have to retract and hold that position in there as well. So you can change the muscles that are working. You can change the training response based on the weight and the movement, but also your intent. Like perhaps you take that weight and you focus on moving it very slow eccentrically. Like that. You're changing the game. Your blood pressure just rose. The physiological response, your hormone response is going to be different. Like that.
Yeah, and I think also like something I remember talking a lot about were stabilizers, right? Like, so example, if I'm doing a handstand, right? Where suddenly I'm just asking my body to stay still.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not moving, but the amount of work involved is huge.
Yeah.
Right? Suddenly there's all these little things that are starting to work, like the muscles in my fingers.
Yeah.
I can feel my rotator cuff kind of shifting.
Yeah.
Right? And suddenly I am engaging all of these muscle groups, but in a very different way.
Yep.
Where it's less about movement now and it's actually more about balance and stabilization.
Yes.
And that can have a very positive effect on the body, I would think, as well.
Absolutely. And then there's a guy who's a strength coach at the University of Minnesota,
Okay.
Cal Dietz, and he has this triphasic training system.
Yeah.
And the base level is isometric strength. Do you
Yeah.
have the capacity to hold position first?
Yeah.
Right? Because in movement, we have the isometric, concentric, and eccentric phases of movement, right? And like, can you maintain a position, right? So everybody that's interested in fitness has probably done a plank, the most
Yeah.
classic isometric.
Yeah.
But can you hold an overcoming isometric, right? Where you maintain the level of output, but now that exercise moves. That's like a base level of strength.
Yeah.
You know, right? We're talking about capacity building. You should have to earn the right to move up. Right. So can you control your body in space?
Yeah.
Before you ever touch a weight, can you control your body in space? That should be earned and moved up. So absolutely, like, try holding a handstand against a wall for 1 minute. I mean, I guarantee there's so many people out there that
Can't do it.
can bench press 200 pounds but can't hold themselves upside down.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and I've seen that a lot. And I think like if I go back to martial arts, for example, especially in a striking art, like let's say if I'm hitting with a knee or I'm hitting a kick, if I just give myself a big swing, I can get that knee to go up and come back down. That's
Yeah.
easy. But can I go in slow motion and hold my knee in that position
Yes.
for 5 seconds and then slowly bring it back? See, to me, that is mastery of a movement.
Yes.
Right? Is that person who can slow it down so that you see like the balance is on point.
Mm-hmm.
It's also positioning. Sometimes it's just move your feet in the right position and suddenly everything changes.
Yeah.
Right? The foundation on which you're standing.
Yeah.
And I think to me that was always more impressive is when you see someone able to do this very difficult movement at this very slow pace.
Yeah.
That's where you see like, okay, he really understands the movement and his body understands the movement.
Yeah.
Right? It's the body's ability to do it that demonstrates the amount of years of practice that went into achieving that, right?
Very much so. And I agree that's mastery of skill.
Yeah.
Right? So there should be a hierarchy of skill acquisition, and motor control is at the base.
Yeah.
Because it's very easy to move quickly and make mistakes. And honestly, that's where a lot of injuries come from. Right? So before you move ballistically and quickly, can you master the range of motion and hold control in it? Not only does that demonstrate mastery of skill, but your injury risk goes way down. Because I feel, and observationally I've seen working with athletes and people, there's conscious skill acquisition and demonstration, and then unconscious skill, right? You've seen like a good fighter react. They didn't think about it, they just did. But that came from hours of conscious practice over and over and over, right? And the brain, right, that neural system like link immediately reacted. It's the same thing. You must consciously practice before you can unconsciously demonstrate. So it's like those people that take the time to move slowly, control, will be able to stay safer and move better over the long term.
Yeah, and I think in other sports too, like whether it's basketball or football, where your ability to unconsciously get into the right position to absorb a hit, or unconsciously get into the right position to catch the ball so that if you do get hit, you're not twisted in some weird angle that's going to make it more likely that you might get injured when you get hit.
Yeah.
Right? Or in basketball, if you jump, how do you land on that jump?
Yeah.
You don't have time to think about it. You're not in the game jumping for a rebound and then thinking, oh yeah, don't forget to bend your knees when you, right? But if you've done it over and over and over in practice and you've conditioned your body in that way to be able to take that impact when you land, that's going to have a huge consequence on your performance, not only your performance, but lowering your risk of injury, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I worked with a physical therapist one time that we all have compensations, right? You know, like over time we all develop patterns of compensation, right? Versus for me, like right now, it's easier for me to slouch down into the sitting position than to sit erect. and when I move, those compensations are magnified, right? Like if I'm deadlifting, 400 pounds, my position is perfect. But as I start to increase the weight to 500 and up, like you may start to see some spinal rounding and some compensation, right? And he described the best athletes as the people with the least compensations, right? Because compensations lead to torque bleed, put force in places they shouldn't be, joints, right, and cause injury. So he said that the purest, least injurable athletes are the ones with the fewest compensations. The people that when they jump, they land and their knees track perfectly, right? And that's, you know, if you see a pro athlete, they're a perfect mover.
Yeah.
Like they didn't get there without
They were just lucky to get. Yeah.
They hit the gene lottery, you know, and then on top of that worked really hard.
Yeah.
But, you know, so like that, like you're saying, like that movement, there was a time when that person might have had to rehab or they had to practice and think consciously about like, how do I, you know, land when I do this and things like that.
Yeah, and I think, but again, sometimes it's also the boring stuff that people don't want to bother with. And I think that's sometimes the difference too about the serious athlete and the weekend athlete is the serious athlete understands, or at least has a coach that understands the importance of these base movements, of these very foundational types of things, as where the weekend athlete, they just want to run in, they just want to get in there. They don't really think about the consequences of what they're doing. They're also not sacrificing their body in the same way. They're probably not training as often. They're not working as often. But that can also lead to injury because their body's just not ready to perform at the level they're expecting it to, right?
Yeah, and I mean, like, that's the difference between exercising and training. Yeah. Training is doing the shit you don't want to do. Yeah. Exercising is only doing the stuff you want to do. Yeah. And exercising is going to get you so far, and then you're going to fall off a cliff because you're not doing the stuff, the maintenance. Yeah. You know, like, I think
that's a cool way of looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, that is the difference. It's the difference in commitment. You know, you have to understand that it's a discipline. You only get one body, and because entropy, we're going to fall apart no matter what. Yeah. And you
entropy
are committed.
Sucks.
It does. It's the worst. And it's just over time you're going to degrade, and it's like, how important is this stuff to you? You know, like, you could complain, like, oh, you know, like, my back is, you know, I'm at a certain age or I've done this stuff, my back and this, my shoulder doesn't work the way that it used to and stuff. And it's like, do you want to keep doing the things that you're doing? Yeah. Okay, then you must do this work. Yeah. And if you don't do the work, you can't do the things and don't complain. Yeah. But it's like, here is the reality. We have science to support this. Like, you have to take care of your body in this way. You're not going to be 21. Yeah. Like, it's just not going to happen. Yeah. But there's a way to still perform at an immensely high level, but you just have to do more work.
Yeah, and I think for me, what I'm starting to shift towards is this idea of functional fitness versus performance fitness, right? And the idea that there's not really much that I want to perform at, in the sense that I don't want to break any records. Yeah. I'm not sparring anymore. I have no intention of doing that. I'm not really competing in any sports. I just want to know that if I want to do something physical, like if I want to run, if I want to jump, or if I have to run, or if I have to jump. You know, I teach self-defense, and a big part of what I teach is this idea of functional fitness, where if shit goes down, like physical shit, you better be ready for it. Yeah. Like, you don't know what's going to happen. Like, even something as simple as getting into a car accident or anything where suddenly your physicality is going to have a huge impact on the outcome of that situation. Yeah. Right? So that's kind of the shift for me, is like, okay, and also time. You know, the older you get, the busier you get. When you're a kid, you can play all day and train all day. But at some point, you kind of have to figure out, all right, I only have 30 minutes today. Yeah. What's the best way for me to spend that 30 minutes? Yeah, I want to do something that's kind of fun and that's going to motivate me to do it. But I also want to think about what's the best way for me to spend that 30 minutes. So do you have any ideas on that? On like, how do you find that functional fitness kind of space?
So I love your definition of fitness. I think to me, like we talked about last time we spoke, it's having the physical capacity to do the things you need to do to enjoy your life. Yeah. Right? If you like to go trail running, can you go run 20 miles? Yeah. Or like, if it's like you like to go to Pilates class, can you go to Pilates? Yeah. Can you pick up stuff in your house without pain? Can you run around with your kids? Right? And I think that there's certain areas that we all need to address. And this is an oversimplification, right? But we're taught simple is good for the general population. When we're talking athletes, we need to be very careful about training modalities and things like that. But for the general person, they just want a simple application that works with their life. I think that you should pick heavy things up 3 times a week, right? For 30 to 45 minutes. I think that you should get your heart rate raised aerobically 3 to 5 times a week for 20 minutes or more. And I think you should sprint twice a week, right? And sprint doesn't necessarily mean run.
Could be on a bike. Could be,
there's a T-Rex tracing you, that heart rate. Get it up there like that. And generally, you'll be able to do anything that you want to do. Within the movement, the weight training, which is more my area of expertise, you need to train through all planes of movement, right? You need to get off balance. You need to drop the barbell, move with one hand, balance, stretch, crawl, move through all the human movement patterns, hinge, lunge, press, pull, all those things within one circuit and one training session like that. And I mean, the nice thing is that we now have so much technology and equipment available. There's limitless options in terms of opportunity to do that.
Yeah, and I think even what you're saying about lifting heavy, like I basically train in this little studio that we're in right now in my house. I don't have any weights.
Yeah.
But what I do have, I have some pretty wicked resistance bands that I've been able to use in so many different ways, and that provide just as much resistance as if I was lifting heavy weights.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing I did is I went to Home Depot and I got some of these cement blocks, and I stick a freaking a stick through those, and suddenly I can use those to do curls. And for me, it makes it fun, first of all, because it feels like I'm being creative at the same time. Yeah, it requires a little bit of extra education, but I think it's also through exploration. I also feel it's a little bit safer at my age to be using these resistance bands, because with the resistance bands, if I can't handle it, it just doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
As where if I'm trying to lift something heavy and it's already up in the air and I can't lift it, the risk factor goes up.
The variable tension from the band is definitely safer.
Yeah.
And I mean, look at Pavel Tatsuin, like the father of American kettlebell training. Bringing them over. Like, the guy just does dips.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and he's an animal, so it's like you don't need much.
Yeah.
Gyms are awesome with all their equipment and everything, but simple is often better for a lot of people, especially like in terms of skill acquisition. Like, to teach someone how to do a clean and jerk takes a lifetime.
Yep.
To teach someone how to pick a kettlebell off the ground takes 3 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's like what gives you the most bang for your buck, quickest, safest, like that.
Yeah. And I also think Bodyweight is highly underestimated in terms of
100%.
results.
Yeah.
Like, I remember I was in and out of gyms only because I worked in a lot of martial arts studios where sometimes the equipment was pretty minimal. Like, they might have some rusty old bench set in the corner, but I wouldn't trust putting too much weight on that thing.
Yeah.
So a lot of my training was push-ups, pull-ups, dips, the stuff that you can do anywhere. And suddenly I ended up back in a weight room and I started lifting, and I was like, I'm a lot stronger than I thought I was, because you're only lifting your own body weight, so you have no measure at that point.
Yeah.
But suddenly it's like I'm going a little bit further on the dumbbell rack and realizing, like, okay, I haven't, as far as functional fitness goes, this is more than strong enough.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, look at, so they've done studies, right, with gymnasts, right, who only do bodybuilding or body weight training on the rings and stuff like that, and they take them into a weight room and they crush per body weight numbers, never having touched the weight. So they don't even have the skill of manipulating the barbell, but they're just pound for pound, their weight to strength ratio is unreal.
Plus the fact that they're gymnasts, they also have an amazing amount of mobility and flexibility.
Yeah, their movement vocabulary is immense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people underestimate that too, even in terms of strength. Like, how far you're able to take your arms, how far you're able to go down into a squat. It's going to have a huge impact on how much weight you're able to lift, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And like, these powerlifters train themselves very specifically. It is a sport, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is that they will create such a length-tension relationship in their musculature that they can only get to the bare minimum required range of motion for a positive lift, right?
Yeah.
So they're going to hit exactly 90 degrees in the squat, and their body physically can go no lower. Some of these guys have to have like 200-300 pounds on their back just to drive them into the bottom of that squat.
That's crazy.
But they're sport-specific athletes, and they pay for it down the line. The hip replacements in their 40s, things like that. For the average person, the more capacity you can express, the longer your joint is going to last.
Yeah.
Like if you can do a split and you're 50, like,
you're good.
Yeah, you're not going to have a hip replacement. So,
yeah.
So the more capacity you have for the average person, the better. And I would argue for most athletes too, unless your sport is so specific like those powerlifters, like if you're a football player and you have a greater range of motion in your hip, when you get hit from the side and you get pushed into a split with a 300-pound lineman on you and your hip has been in that position before, and now you're not going to get injured. Yeah. Right? So like for them, it behooves them to spend time doing that capacity building training.
Yeah, and I think also what we're seeing a lot more in sports is people cross-training and realizing that sport-specific training can be very detrimental to the sport itself, but also down the line.
Yes.
So a good example of that is I was in a kind of a sports performance gym. I was working there for a bit, and we were working with high-level hockey players. Okay, one guy, in fact, who ended up getting drafted and who now plays in the NHL. And what amazed me was these guys couldn't run.
Yeah.
Like, take their skates off, and they were running as if they were skating. Like, they were running with their feet open, and their knees were going to the side. It was the most awkward-looking thing, and they were supposed to be running sprints.
Yeah.
And it was just like, oh, wow.
He spent too much time on the ice.
Right, but that's the thing is, since these guys were kids, that's all they ever did was skate. Like, in the summer, they were skating. In the winter, they were skating. Like, and I think now we're learning that, guess what? Take the summer off, do something else, and when you come back to your sport, you will improve versus thinking that because I take time off, I'm going to lose something.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think let's differentiate between professional athletes and the general population.
Yeah.
Because for professional athletes, it's opportunity cost. There's only so many training hours in the day.
Yeah.
And if you want to become the best hockey player, is it in your best interest to spend time learning how to sprint? Perhaps not.
No, but what I'm thinking though, however, is it's not that. It's like, okay, now why all of a sudden were they in the gym sprinting?
Well,
That's what I'm talking about. Is that suddenly, because he started fixing his sprinting technique, because he started fixing his body to perform in all aspects of movement, not just hockey, his hockey got stronger.
There are definitely some instances of carryover. I mean, the Russians used to have their wrestling team play soccer.
Yeah.
Right? Just, as general
Footwork,
aerobic fitness and quickness and things like that. There's definitely some carryover. I think for the average person, more is better, right?
Yeah.
Like we have these kids that are becoming sports specialists at like age 8. Like, I'm a baseball player. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Play everything, do everything, and improve your movement vocabulary. It is very clear that repetitive motion is detrimental to the body.
Yeah.
Golfers, that one-sided swing, baseball
tennis.
Players, these things are not, our body has a limited amount of articulations at each joint, and just repeatedly doing the same thing ruins them. So, for a generalist or just the average person, you have to ask yourself, like, what's the end game here?
Yeah.
Like, what are you training for? Are you training to enjoyment, but at age 70 you can't get out of your chair because you squatted too much? Like what, what is the end game? That's an important question. Yeah.
And I think it's a hard question to ask yourself sometimes. In your 20s, it's impossible. You're not thinking end game at all. In your 30s, you're trying to hold on to your 20s for the most part, and you're still able to do it. If I'm speaking from personal experience, 20s, it's like all out, no thinking of the future whatsoever.
Yeah.
In the 30s, it's like, I can still keep up with a 20-year-old, so I'm going to keep doing this because my ego is telling me keep going.
Yeah.
And then in your 40s, it's like, okay, wait a minute.
Yeah.
That hurt. That wasn't easy. I shouldn't have been able to do that. Now I can't. Does it matter though? Like, no, not really. Like for me, what's important now is, one, I have a 13-year-old son. I want to keep up with him.
Yeah.
At some point, he will surpass me. That's just the reality. He already has in some ways, you know. But I think it's being, okay, but what do I want to do with him?
Yeah.
Like being able to go for a run with him, or throw the football with him, or do things that we can enjoy together, but that we don't have to compete at.
Yes.
Right? And as a trainer, I've seen it so many times where I'm teaching a kids class and all the parents are on the sidelines and they have no intention of participating. Like they can't do anything with their kids because they physically just can't.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's sad.
Yeah.
It's sad when you have kids and you can't keep up with them. Mm-hmm. Like little kids, like even teenagers, And I think the more active you are with your kid, the more of an example you're setting for your kid.
100%.
And I think that for me, that's probably my biggest motivation right now is I want to make sure that when my son is 13, 14, 15, 16, I'm still able to do those things with him.
Yeah.
And that alone is, I think, motivation enough to get up and do the mobility work and do the boring stuff, but that I know is going to have a super positive effect on my body.
For sure. And I mean, we have to think of it from an evolutionary standpoint too. An immobile animal is a dead animal.
Pretty
right?
much,
If you are part of a pack or a tribe or a pride, and you can't move,
you get left
abandoned.
behind. Yeah, you're
and human history.
You're saber-toothed tiger food.
Yeah, it's only been very recently in our human history, within the last 200 to 300 years, that you didn't work until you died.
Yeah.
Like once you basically were physically unable to work, you couldn't contribute to society. That was the end of you. Yeah. We've created this very soft society where like physical capacity is no longer tied to health. Yeah. You can be kept alive with blood pressure medication and things. When you get diabetes, have artificial insulin and like all these things. And what the sad part is, we can prolong life, but we can't improve quality of life with these things. Yeah. Right? You see these people that, they hit about mid-30s, 40s, and their bad habits lead to this fairly gradual decline until death. Right? Versus this other arc where if you take care of yourself, you basically maintain a very high quality of life physically until a very precipitous drop at the end.
Yeah.
But up until that point in your 80s or 90s, like you were living a very high quality of life. And it comes down to the choices you're talking about.
Yeah. And one of my favorite stories that I tell a lot is when I just started martial arts training, maybe 2 years into it, and there was a man in the gym who was a black belt in Kajukembo, which is a not that well-known form of martial arts. And he was just, maybe 6'2", super built, took his leg, stuck it straight up in the air, would destroy a punching bag. Like just this really like complete looking athlete to me, you know, and I was just really impressed with him. And I remember the owner of the gym came by to talk to me, and he's like, guess how old that guy is? And looking at him, I said, probably late 30s. Usually if someone says, guess how old they are, they're older than you think.
Of course.
But I thought, you know, maybe late 30s or early 40s at the latest, at the most. And he was, I think, 52 or 53 years old.
Yeah.
And he moved like unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. And I went to ask him straight up. I'm like, what's your secret? How is it that you're 50? I think he had just had his first grandchild. And I'm like, how is this possible? He's like, don't stop.
Yeah. Momentum is very important.
He said, don't stop. He said, when I was in my 20s, it was easy. Then I had children in my 30s. And where everyone else that I used to train with suddenly took breaks, too much work, the kids are too much, they're not eating well. And then in their 40s, they try to come back.
Yeah.
And they just can never achieve that level anymore because the body just, I think that when you don't slow down, I mean, slow down and be smart about it.
Yeah.
But as soon as you stop completely, that's when age starts catching up.
Don't ever stop, yeah.
That's when age starts catching 100%. Up. That's when the cells start deteriorating. That's when the mitochondria aren't producing the way they used to. That's when aging science starts to take over.
Yeah.
But as long as you stay moving, you kind of trick your body into saying, okay, I'm not going to age because we're still moving.
Yeah.
Right? Like I know it's a dumb way of looking at it, but it's a very simple way of looking at it. But that's kind of what I've always told myself is even if I'm injured, even if I can't train on my legs because I have a bad foot or whatever, I can still do upper body stuff.
Yeah,
if my arms hurt, I can use my legs.
Yeah.
If everything hurts, I can at least sit down and do some yoga, or I can breathe, or I can do something physical that's going to keep me engaged with my physical self. I think now we're in a place where so many people are completely detached from their physical selves.
Yeah.
Because they live through their phone, they live through their computers, they live on a chair, they have everything at hand's reach. They don't have to get up. They can order their food. They can order their stuff on Amazon. Like, they don't have to move.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're seeing a part of society that is just kind of going into this almost virtual space where they're just no longer physical beings.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of, I don't know, that seems to be where it's going in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've removed that physical element of our culture in a lot of ways. And the movement culture that's coming back is like a minority group that's almost like fighting back against that, I think, and seeing it as like more of a lifestyle than just, you know, just exercise. Yeah. And I think that's great. Yeah. I think the problem is, like, especially in Western culture, exercise is detached from life. Yeah. It is something you go and do and then you leave. It's extra. Yeah, it's extra, right? And we have this mentality about exercise where even a few generations ago it was just a chore. It was life.
Yeah, it was life. Moved. Yeah. You had to move because you had to get places. Yeah, and like you had to work. You had to work the fields, you had to build your house, you had to chop wood to heat your stove, whatever that is, you know.
And our removal of that physical element from our lives, like, I mean, look at all the statistics. Like, the United States is disgusting in terms of obesity and these self-imposed diseases. The things that kill more people in this country are brought on by their own behavior. 100%. You know, which is tragic in so many reasons and ways, if you want to look at it from expense or whatever, but it's all preventable disease. Yeah. You know, and it's just, it's such a strange sort of thing where the irony of modern society is we've committed ourselves to like this death sentence that's totally avoidable. Yeah. You know, but I think until culturally we understand that exercise is part of our experience, you don't go to a gym. You should always be in a gym, right? Like, movement should be part of your daily life. You know, until there's sort of a true flip in that thought process, I don't see like a large scale
and I also
change.
think that, like, for me growing up, movement was sport.
Yes.
Like, if you didn't play a sport, you weren't really moving. Like, there was no, I mean, as a kid, you're on the playground, you're playing tag, you're doing all those things. I mean, once you get to an age where you're no longer playing those kids' games, if you're not an athlete playing a sport, you're not moving. And you're not given opportunities to move. Yeah. Right? And I think that this movement culture that's coming through, what I appreciate about it is that you're suddenly giving an opportunity to people or to kids that aren't athletes. Yes. Right? Like, the non-athletic kid is no longer sitting on the sideline. The non-athletic kid is doing parkour. Yes. The non-athletic kid is doing mobility training or movement training, or he's like, now there's gyms that are building these rigs so that there's monkey bars and rings and all of this fun stuff that you get to play as an adult. Yeah. Right? I get to go back to the playground, but now my gym built me a playground. Yeah. You know, and for me, it was just like, that's what kept me going. Even once martial arts stopped being a thing that I wanted to compete at or I wanted to take very seriously, I discovered like, oh, parkour is awesome. I don't
Yeah.
have to jump off buildings to enjoy it. I can
Yeah.
do it in a safe way.
Yep.
But I'm just moving. I'm
Yeah.
running, I'm jumping, I'm climbing, right? And I'm giving it a name so that I'm at least practicing something that might make me feel like I learned something.
Yeah.
And I think also you're seeing kids now where it's kind of bringing the play back into training, right? Where it's no longer exercise, it's actually fun. It's
Yeah.
actually kind of cool to do these things. Or a good friend of mine, Max, who's into what he calls unconventional training. So maces and kettlebells.
Yeah.
And what's the other one he uses? Those like Indian clubs. And
Yeah.
a lot of stuff that just makes you feel kind of like a warrior. And it's like, holy shit, I'm like, but when you think about it, you know, prehistorically or just looking back at our ancestors, these were weapons that were used, you know? So
Yeah.
there's like part of your DNA is like,
Primal
wait, this
element,
feels
yeah.
kind of right for me to hold this thing, right?
Yeah.
So I think the more options we create, the better.
100%.
Because it's just that guy who maybe wouldn't get up to play football or soccer or baseball, he might be really into something like parkour, or he might be into martial arts, or he might be into like swinging a mace around for a couple, you know?
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I love weightlifting.
Yeah.
It's part of my background, but I generally, like for me, my goal with anyone I work with and anyone that I care about is to have a physical practice of some sort. It doesn't, that's mine. That's the one that I enjoy the most, and that may change as I get older. But I think like whether it's anything you can name, yoga, Pilates, whether it's running, you know, going biking, swimming, doing triathlons, whatever it is, or something non-competitive like you're talking about, just for like dance, just to have a
Dance
physical
is a good-
practice.
yeah.
But you can't, just like you can't neglect sort of like your spiritual side, your intellectual side, your physical side needs to be fed as well. I mean, Socrates has that like that famous quote that people love putting up all the time about, you know, every citizen should have mastery of their body and stuff like that. But the idea is like, you need to be well-rounded. You need to feed all these parts of your being, and like you can't be the intellectual sloth in the chair just as you can't be the meathead in the gym.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. You need that balance between all areas in order to achieve health.
Yeah.
You know, and like that's basically going to determine the quality of your life.
So, man, I think we could talk for hours on this stuff,
Yeah.
honestly. But I think we touched on some really good stuff there. Hopefully people get some information and some knowledge. So moving forward, first of all, how can people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about what you do? I love that you train people online, which kind of opens this up to anybody in the world who's interested in what you do. And let's just finish it up with that.
For sure. Well, I'm on Instagram as Brandon Sundwall Fitness.
I'll put everything in the description anyway. But
yeah, absolutely. And happy to always I just like sharing information.
Yeah.
I was a teacher at one point in my life. I like education is like my first motivation with people. So I'm happy to share with any questions, answer any questions. All information about like training and everything is at brandonsundwallfitness.com.
Perfect.
And yeah, like I'm always available. This is my life. I geek out on this. It's my passion, also what I do for work. So I just love sharing, and I'm sure. So, happy to talk with anyone at any time.
Yeah. And if I just want to add, man, I think what I got from this conversation is, first of all, you obviously love what you do.
I appreciate that.
It's pretty obvious. I think you've put a lot of effort into learning as well, because just the way that you're able to go into these pretty complicated topics and make it sound pretty simple.
I appreciate that.
That to me is very much appreciated. So thanks a lot for doing this, and look forward to doing more stuff in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
Awesome, man. Good.